Our parable begins with Jesus leaving a home to sit alone by the sea when a crowd started to form around him. He then walked over to sit in a boat where the crowd continued to gather on the shore, and Jesus began to recite a parable about sowing seeds. Seeds planted on rocky ground were ultimately killed because of the climate. Exposed seeds were eaten by looming birds. Others planted among thorns were overpowered, but the seeds planted on good soil were able to flourish and produce crops. Many of us have heard this sermon in reference to evangelism or planting our faith in good soil, but today I'm going to speak about something a little more practical or mundane, and that is rest. Now you may be thinking, is Bridget really going to use the parable of the sower to talk about how God is calling us to rest? Yes, I am. Rest may take different forms and look different from person to person depending on our immediate needs, but it is a sacred act. Rather than focusing on the seeds and the potential harvest that comes from the seeds, today I want to focus on the sower and the physical labor that the sower exerts throughout this process. Now, rest may not be the obvious takeaway from the story at first glance, but I do feel that during this time and through this story, God is calling us to pause and check in with our bodies. Put frankly, sowing seeds requires energy. Any experienced gardener, field laborer, or a farmer can tell us that even though groundwork can be rewarding, it almost always is hard on the body in some way. In the parable, we see the sower travel from terrain to terrain sowing seeds. We're never told exactly how far away each distance is, but I imagine that there was some distance apart from each other. And it may have even required some travel on the sower's part from his home to reach his place of work. During this period, it was typical for the very wealthy to have servants or groundspeople to care for the land that they owned. The wealthy were not actually working the fields, but they oversaw the process from afar. Those working the land were no stranger to the concept of working to meet deadlines. Because of this, I believe it's safe to assume that the sower is familiar with what it looks like to wrestle with maintaining a healthy work-life balance. Because of the coronavirus pandemic, many of us are working long hours and are experiencing new aches and pains in our bodies, whether we're working from home or whether we're working on location with a more cautious demeanor than we would have a year ago. We're now face to face with questions about how to make sure we're spending time with our loved ones, but also fulfilling our work obligations. And this morning I ask you, how are you prioritizing your rest in the midst of all of this? Life is requiring a lot of energy from us right now, even with tasks that were once mundane. Quick runs to the grocery store to grab a few items before dinner now inherently require masks, possibly long lines upon entry, markers differentiating exit and entrance routes along aisles, and a sanitization process once we return home with our needed items. Whether it's modified work routines, grocery runs, social distancing, or staying indoors, it's almost impossible to ignore the wear and tear that this pandemic has had on our bodies. It's also important for us to remember that rest may look different for each of us, but it's always a mental, emotional, and spiritual experience. Before Jesus tells the story, we see Jesus leave the home he was staying at to be by himself, an act that I call sacred solitude. Jesus knew what the day ahead of him had in store, and he chose to prepare his whole self for the day by getting grounded. In this action, Jesus models the importance of pouring into our own cups before we serve others. In this story, Jesus' rest may have taken the form of deep, intentional breaths and grounding himself emotionally and spiritually. For the sower, his rest may have taken the form of physically sleeping at the end of the day or taking naps when possible. Like Jesus and the sower, We may live in a capitalistic society, but our bodies belong to us. Our bodies belong to God. The toxicity of capitalistic and white supremacist thoughts may pressure us to strive for perfection and pull all-nighters to complete tasks, but our bodies were not designed to run like machines. These harmful notions teach us to compromise our rest in order to maximize our productivity. Unfortunately, being exhausted at the end of the day is not necessarily the sign of a productive day. We must remember the importance of respecting our divine nature and honoring our body's limits. Even if we do the work of sowing the seeds, our bodies have to have enough rest in order to be ready to harvest what was sown. I'm not sure what form of rest you may need to prioritize this week, but I encourage you to check in with your body, as I will mine. Part of this check-in includes asking ourselves hard questions like, if we're going to condemn white supremacist, patriarchal notions, we have to look inside and question whether we've internalized any of these ideals. Are we overworking ourselves? Are we allowing our bodies to rest? Are we allowing others to rest? In the spirit of checking in with our bodies, I'd like to take a few moments to ground ourselves, to take a few intentional deep breaths collectively. I personally will place one hand over my chest and one on my abdomen and feel the rise and fall of my stomach as I breathe. I invite you to breathe with me. Let's take 3 collective breaths together. We breathe in and out. We breathe in and out. I invite you to relax your shoulders, maybe unclench your jaw. Feel the seat beneath you. Trust that the God that has brought you this far is faithful to complete the good work God has begun in you. As we take these deep breaths, I invite you to extend yourself the same grace you extend to others. Our bodies are sacred. Our bodies are worthy of rest. Thank you for your time this morning, and I hope you are able to reflect on this throughout your week about what your rest patterns look like and how you are prioritizing your rest this week. Thank you.